Okay, hi guys. Hi. Okay, so my name's Brittney. I am interning at a 7th grade center up here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So usually I work with 12-year-olds. You guys are a little bit older than that. So bear with me if I make some funny jokes. Okay. All right, so going off of what we actually just talked about, who can tell me what words come to mind when they think of feminism? Feminism. Yes.
Women's rights.
I can't hear. Sorry.
Women's rights.
Women's rights. Okay. Yes.
It's like being independent and not being equal to men.
Right. Equality. Anything else? Positive or negative? It's okay. Anything? Only 2 people? Come on, one more person. Glass ceiling. Good. That's a good one. So that's about pay and getting into higher positions. Women usually can't reach as high of positions as men, even in today's society. So today we're going to talk about what's called the Seneca Falls Convention. Does anyone know what that is? Seneca, New York. Okay. So what this was a convention for women everywhere. That's how it was kind of portrayed to the public. So it was in July 19th and 20th, 1848. So what else is going on during this time that we just talked about? Industrial Revolution, good. What else? Prelude to the Civil War, good. Anything else? Okay, well this is the time when the Victorian sort of era is on the way out. So people have noticed that it's unachievable and they're trying to come up with different things. So it was a women's right movements had begun to rise in the early 1800s. Lots of women were tired of sitting around in their home knitting or like fixing their husband's socks all day, and I'm not exaggerating, that's literally what they did. So the leaders were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Usually when you hear those names, they're very important to women's history. The convention was initially planned as a women's only event. So when they sat down to get this together, there were about 5 to 10 women. And they sat down and said, we need to talk about things that we need to change for women. I'm tired of sitting in my home. I want to be able to do this. I want to get my own income, things like that. This was really the very first feminist movement ever in the entire world. Sure, there have been people that said, I want to work or anything, but this is the first time it was ever organized, and it happened right here in the United States. So by the second day, over 300 men and women were in attendance at the event. So by the time word got out about this, they were only expecting a few women to show up, maybe 50, and it reached over 300. Does everyone know who Frederick Douglass is? Who can tell me who he is? Yes. Oh, it's okay. Does anyone want to say who he is? He is good. So he's also someone who's working towards equality and civil rights movements. Okay? So the leaders and many of the attendees were Quakers from around the area of Seneca Falls. Now who can tell me who Quakers are? What are they?
Society of Friends.
Society of Friends, good, that's another name. Hey guys. Yes?
Aren't they very into peace and
Right, they're a very non-violent group. Anything else? Oatmeal? That's a good one, right? I know that the guy with the grow box is Quakers. Okay, so one of the big things about Quakers is they're one of the only religious groups at the time who did see men and women as equal and on equal terms. Men and women both did the same types of work. Men and women were both responsible for the household, and that was why many of these people were supported by Quakers. So it's very important that we remember that that kind of was a foothold. They had a foothold in a large population in the north. Most Quakers can be found in the Pennsylvania area and up north in Europe. Okay. So this is Lucretia and Elizabeth. I know they're not the lookers. So usually today when you hear about feminism, you think of a young woman who's, fighting for her rights and everything. But these were actually well-educated in their home, maybe not out of school, but these were well-educated, well-brought-up older women who had lived through this whole thing. They weren't reaching the precipice of their adult life. They were past it and wanting a change for the women of the future. So just keep that in mind. They were kind of older women. Okay, so while they're at this convention, they come up with this thing called the Declaration of Sentiments. So what kind of word does sentiment mean? Intentions, good. Anything else? What's a sentiment? Good, it's important, and it's something that you want to get done. It's what you think. So at first when they were just sitting around, they were just talking about different issues. And at one point it was brought up, we need to write this all down. We want to get this out and publish it for the world. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton kind of took that upon herself. And I just wanted to read you the beginning of the sentiment and tell me what it sounds like. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to such course. What does that kind of sound like? The Declaration of Independence, right. So this was a way that they thought women needed to become independent. They felt like, maybe not in the same sense, but they felt slaves to society. They had all these strict Victorian laws that hadn't completely reached America just yet, or hadn't completely left America. So they were tired of having to do all this and all these strict guidelines. So they proposed it on July 16th, and actually Frederick Douglass, when he heard about it, he said they were crazy, that they were all going to get laughed at. He said, I support your cause, but crazy, in other words. So, but once he read it, and once the convention was held and the women got up to speak, he ended up changing his mind and said it was the grand movement for attaining the civil, social, political, and religious rights of women. So what can you think were probably some of the religious rights that women were wanting? I hear some murmurs. Somebody, right to vote? Good. So sometimes if a church wanted to make decisions, at this point, women were not allowed to even speak within some churches, depending on the denomination. So it'd be very hard to sit there and have to listen to everything and not be able to speak what you would like to say. So some of the major points that they wanted to get across were the right to own and manage property. If a woman had nowhere to live, she was out of luck. She couldn't go buy an apartment for her, or her and her girlfriends couldn't go find somewhere to live. They were completely under the control of their husband or their brother or their father. So right to liberty from the husband or father. They didn't want that to be looming over them. It would be really hard if all the way into your 40s and 50s, if you weren't married and your father still got to tell you what to do. You'd kind of feel a little trapped. The right to divorce. At this time, a woman could not ask for a divorce. Only a husband could, and he had to have no cost. He could just say, I'm done with you, and walk out the door. Quick and easy. A woman could not get a divorce for almost any reason. It was very rare. And when they did, on either side, it was always the men were given custody of the children. So even though they had never maybe done anything in the household for the children, they still got custody. So the women usually lost contact with their children immediately as the divorce went through, which would be very hard as a mother, especially if you were home all day with them. So the right to work. Some women in the lower classes, mostly the middle class, they didn't want to stay home. This isn't mostly the high society women. They were kind of content with where they were. But many of these women wanted the right to work and earn a living so that they could be independent. The right to education, like we were talking about earlier, none of these women could go to school or anything like that. They maybe went to primary school, but after you were done with primary school, you were gone. So look around the room and how many women are in this classroom. If it had stayed the way it was, this would be a lot more empty. So it does have a big impact, even if you don't really think about it right away. So a right to involvement in church affairs. This again is the religious thing. They wanted to be able to speak up. They wanted to talk about problems in the church, or maybe they wanted to start a charity event, but they were not given any word. And the right to vote and representation. This was the biggest one. This is the one where about half the people were saying, yes, we want the right to vote, and the other half were saying, that's too much, we're pushing it too far. At this point, women felt, at least these women, felt that they had no representation in government. And they wanted representation in government just like America had fought for not that many years ago. About like less than 100 years ago, we were wanting representation in our government, and the men won that and the women didn't. So they were very confused on why this was extended to them, to men, but not to women. So they wanted representatives in government, which you all know still took a while. There are still not very many women in Congress or in Senate. If there are, they're definitely the minority. So we are still struggling with this representation today, not to mention representation for other minority groups within our government. So, the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. This is a quote from the Declaration of Sentiments. This is their message to the world. They didn't want to feel like they were enslaved to a society that didn't value them. So, after it was over, there was quite a positive and a very negative view. And some of the negatives I actually laughed at when I read them aloud. From some of the positive remarks, this is the first kind ever held, and one whose influence shall not cease until woman is guaranteed all the rights now enjoyed by the other half of creation. The flag of independence has been hoisted for the second time on this side of the Atlantic. Some people saw this as like a second revolution. And some of the negative remarks. These are quotes from men who were usually newspaper article writers, editors. This bull is the most shocking and unnatural incident ever recorded in the history of womanity. The lords must wash their dishes, scour up, be put to the tub, handle the broom, and darn soft. I know that's such a labor, right? Gosh. Could you imagine having to sweep guys or fold your socks? I know that we're asking a lot of you, right? Right. So this is, and they weren't joking. When they said this, they could not even think that a man should even touch his socks unless they were to be put on. They couldn't imagine picking up a broom. I mean, these were the most helpless guys you've ever seen in the entire world, and yet they were the ones running the government, and they wouldn't even they didn't know how to wash their socks. So, kind of tells you there's got to be some kind of difference there. So this is actually a picture of the Declaration of Sentiments. You can see it in the Library of Congress now. So, a little bit of the historical impact. I really wanted to show you this timeline, mostly so you can see that women's rights, while today is very far advanced from what Katie Stanton and Lucretia Mott had to deal with, it took a very long time, and they are still not. Most people can say that they don't think it's still equal. So lots of things happened in the 1800s. By 1920, the Women's Bureau Department of Labor is formed. The Women's Bureau Department is the ones that women can talk to if they have a grievance about their work. At this point, it was, you're a woman, we gave you a job, why don't you just be quiet? We'll tell you what to do. And that didn't sit well with a lot of people. It wouldn't sit well with me. It wasn't until 1920 that women got the right to vote. So this was quite a few years later, almost 80 years later, and women are just now getting to vote, even though they had asked for it way back in 18. So it took a long time for people to let that set in. Equal Pay Act in the 60s and in the 70s, Title IX, which is educational discrimination. It wasn't until 1994 that the Violence Against Women Act was passed, which means there was more regulation on violence against women. And just last year, the ban on women in combat was lifted. So up until last year, women were not allowed to serve on the battlefield directly in a combat zone, because there were all these different ideas about how women wouldn't be able to do it or handle it. And so now we actually do have women serving on the front line. So there are still a lot of changes that need to be made. So does anyone have any questions?